Welcome to episode number 342 of Get Paid for Your Pad. Today I have a really interesting guest. His name is Syed Latif. He's the CEO and founder of Hostly, a company out of Chicago. He had up to 165 units pre-COVID, and he was looking to do about $6 million in revenue in 2020. And he managed to scale that business in under 2 years, which is pretty crazy to think about. So excited to learn about how you did that, Syed. So Syed, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Jasper.
Absolutely. And you are based in Chicago. And of course, I have a special connection with that city because that's a city where I lived for a year and a half after while I was working in finance. And so I have fond memories of the volleyball on the beach, the barbecues that people would throw as soon as the winter was over, as soon as the cold disappeared, people would just come out and the whole city would explode. So I have a very, very fond memories of that city. So yeah, I appreciate you taking the time.
Nothing is better than summertime Chicago. You know, I was raised here in Chicago all my life, so Chicago is a great city.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't wait to go back there. I haven't been for a while. But let's dive in. You have a pretty incredible story. You managed to go from zero to all the way up to 165 master lease units in under 2 years, which is crazy to think about because that's so fast. And you were able to do that by building strong relationships with larger landlords. So that's really, really interesting, and I can't wait to dive in deep and understand more about how you did that. But let's start off with a quick introduction. Could you share, how did you get into Airbnb initially?
Yeah, so I'll tell you, my background is finance also. You know, I went to school here in Chicago, DePaul University. After I graduated, I got into, corporate America. I worked at a Fortune 500 company as a financial analyst. It started getting, after a few years, I started getting into this bigger pockets phase where I listened to all the bigger pockets podcasts, and everything bigger pockets would say would be about house hacking. So I would always want more than what I had working at, a salary 9 to 5 job. So I ended up looking into buying a multifamily property for myself. It was a 4-unit building in Chicago, and I had a basement unit as well, so which would be the 5th unit. So I purchased that building, in 2017, and in one of the units of the building is where I furnished it for Airbnb. And at that time, I listened to another podcast and Bigger Pockets about a guy that was killing it on Airbnb. So I said, hey, why don't I try it out and see how it goes? And in that time, it was February, where I got it up and running. And then in March, I ended up making 2 times of what the rent would be from a long-term tenant. And I was like, well, this is something crazy. And then it started getting into April and May, and I started making 3 times as much. And I was like, wow, this is like amazing. Like, this is like too good to be true. So I said, hey, I want to make my entire building, Airbnb. So as tenants were renewing their leases, I would put each one of these units onto Airbnb. And I would keep on continuously get the same result, 3 times rent, and then in the slower season, it would be a little less because Chicago is big seasonality. But in the summertime, I want to make 3 times rent. And I said, there's like this huge opportunity. It doesn't matter how many units I keep adding on, I keep getting the same result. So I went to my sister. I said, hey, you got to change your units in your building that you bought as well into Airbnb. And again, she started getting the same results. And I said, hey, there's like an opportunity here. I need to, expand on it. So towards the end of the year, I ended up creating a company, Hostly. It was a property management company. I said, hey, I want to find other people and do this for them. And at that time, this was a business model I thought would be what I would be doing for a long time. It was a management model where I take a percentage of, everyone's revenue, and I would manage their Airbnbs for them. I quickly realized I did not like that model at all. I learned that when you have too many homeowners, it's like they have a control over you, and you're like they're like your boss. They tell you what to do, how to do it. Not happy with the results. So it was about that time where I ended up leaving my job for this, doing it full time too. So it was 2018, January 1 is when I was on my own for good. So there was one client that I met at a networking event, and they the individual at the networking event is like, we're looking for somebody to do Airbnbs in our building. And I was like, what? I'm like this is like the most perfect opportunity for me. I was like, have me do it. So I eventually started following up with them and calling them every day for maybe like 3 months, because the owner of like the company was just like so busy, did not care. I was just so persistent on being able to get a hold of him. And I think finally I just started walking into the office and trying to see who's like the decision maker and have them see me face to face and try to make something happen. I initially pitched him on doing property management, and he furnished it. He ended up telling me he doesn't want to get into the furniture business. He doesn't want to buy furniture and own it and do all this. So at last ditch effort, I was like, hey, can I just rent 2 units from you? And he's like, if you pay rent, you can rent how many units you want to rent. And like this landlord had about more than 1,000 units like on the north side of Chicago. So I ended up taking 2 units on with him, and so this is like the start of my master lease business. And in this time, I was successful. I was paying him rent, and it ended up coming into the winter time. And I was like, hey, listen, you know, um, these are doing good. Can I take on more units? And then he said, yeah, sure, take on more units. How many do you want? I said, let me get these 4. And then I added those 4 on. And then it happened where a few months down the road, I'm like, hey, can I get more? So I added 5 more. And then a month goes on. I'm like, hey, can we add 10 more? And he's like, yeah, let's do 10 more. And then just by proving to him I could, hit the monthly rent is when he ended up allowing me to get my business to 35 units with him. So that was the start of like my master lease business during that time. And I could keep going from there. So then they came to a point where our relationship kind of got a little shaky, um, for whatever reason. I think I was just too small for him, and he started, growing his development business like much bigger. He started buying all these buildings, and he just really did not answer the phone with me out of nowhere. I don't know why. So I started getting worried because we kind of did some of these units on a handshake deal. And at any time, I didn't want to be in a situation where he tells me to pick up my stuff and leave. So one, I was like, all right, we need to start making these into writing and contracts, and then negotiating a contract after you started doing business was not the best idea. We got into a lot of arguments within our lawyers and everything. But I started seeing like, hey, I can't put all my eggs in one basket with just one person. I need to start scaling out to other big time landlords in Chicago. So what I ended up doing is, going online and finding a list of top property management companies in Chicago, and then I saw like a few of them, and I'm like, all right, let me just try to target this one. And then this company, I said it simple as this: I am doing business. I'm doing an Airbnb business with XYZ. Can I do the same exact with you? And again, I don't get a response on the first email. I was so persistent, and I was like hungry initially when I started my business, And finally, after a lot of persistence, he responds back, let's get on a phone call. So then the same process, I've finally been able to get on a phone call with him. He said, okay, fine, meet me in person. And then you could tell a lot if you're going to do business with somebody by like meeting them in person. You can really tell who's in front of you and everything. So it's as simple as showing him the units that I am with the other landlord and saying, hey, look, I've been paying him rent every month for the past year. I'd like to take on units with you as well. And his units were in a better area, and a pretty good price. And I started adding on 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 at a time to finally get 30 with him. Then now having two big time players in Chicago, it was much easier getting another big time landlord on the phone with me because I simply would say, "Hey, I'm doing business with XYZ and ABC," and they would then respond to my emails like almost instantly. Before it would be like months before I get a response. Now it's like, they were responding instantly, like, "Hey, let's get on the call." And I just kept on pitching the different landlords the same story and showing them success. Hey, I know what I'm doing. I know how to manage it. And then I just kept adding units and units and making relationships with them. Finally, I had 165 units in February of 2020.
That's a crazy story, and congratulations on what you have achieved. There's a bunch of things that I wanted to touch on. Number
Sure.
one is the persistency, right? You can't just, if you want to really connect with people like these larger landlords that have that many units, you got to be really, really persistent in your approach, right? You can't give up after, because a lot of people who are kind of at that level, like they get probably like a ton of emails, ton of phone calls every day. So you have to kind of push through in order to get a hold of them. So number one, great job on being persistent and just going after what you want. And then the other thing that I wanted to point out is that um, one question is the seasonality. I know in the winter Chicago gets really, really cold. There's a lot of wind. I remember just walking back and forth from the office in the winter. It was pretty harsh. How do you deal with the seasonality?
Sure. First, I'll talk about the being persistent. And that's something that I kind of miss. That I don't have that drive anymore. I'm being so persistent. Initially, in my business, when I had nothing, it was so hard to get that first phone call, and I would just keep driving it, driving it, driving it until that person comes to me. And then I eventually started getting comfortable on getting those instant responses. But then there comes to a point where you used up all your resources on the people you can connect with in Chicago. And then I start thinking about like, hey, I want to get into this market or in this neighborhood, and I just don't have that that drive anymore to be able to like continuously call and get calls rejected over and over when I started getting used to having it being easy. So persistence is huge. Like I need somebody to like light some fire under my ass to start doing that all over again. Like I need something to happen to me to have that persistence. But it's very important in the beginning. It's not going to come easy. If you're trying to get into this business and you're kind of down about like, hey, I can't get somebody to answer my phone call about this. You just got to keep trying and trying like no other. So yeah, that's my thing on being persistent. And to your second question about seasonality, there's huge seasonality in Chicago. Summertime, like I said, summertime in Chicago is like the best time, and that relates to how much like revenue I make for my units as well. It's almost like a bell curve, in the summertime from April to October, like kind of when like the marathon and Halloween ends, is where you make your money in Chicago. And then November and December is kind of break even, and then January, February, Chicago is so dang cold where you do not make any money at all. You're at huge losses, huge gas bills, frozen pipes. It's not great at all. So you kind of have to manage your cash flow and reserves properly throughout the year to be able to be ready for being able to pay for that January and February. And I could tell you, like, I always have those hiccups where I'm too focused on the growth and I end up spending all my money back in adding more units, where I end up started being scrappy during like the January and February time, where I started delaying and deferring payments from utilities, and paid rent like 5 days late, waiting for that money to come in. So I can't say that I do it the best way. I understand how you should do it, but even with understanding that, I always end up spending my cash too much. And it put me in a very bad situation during this COVID time, right? If January and February I was at huge losses and I was charging up my credit cards that I just opened up for that month, knowing that like March and April is everything's gonna pick back up, everything's gonna be fine. I ended up adding like 50 units in February, taking on debt on my business, and all of a sudden, all right, I'm ready. Middle of March, things are gonna pick up. Spring break happens. People are gonna start traveling, and then boom, I get hit with the brick wall. Left with like this huge losses for the first 2 months and no cash, and to racked up this huge debt, and then I had no bookings left. So it was a very surreal feeling, to like I get like anxious talking about it now after going through it. I can't even imagine going through something like that again. And then at the time, it was just like too much going on, that like I can't even, reflecting on it, it makes me feel like wow, how did that happen? So yeah, so seasonality in Chicago is huge, and I'm sure that's normal in most markets, from my understanding. So you just got to manage your cash reserves properly, or be ready to be savvy enough to be able to get through some of that time. Which
Sure.
I feel
And
like I am a little savvy. I was able to figure it out even this time, even during the worst time possible. I was able to
yeah,
get through it.
well, that gives confidence for the future, right? Because if you were able to make it through this, then
Yeah.
you should be able to make it through any time. Um, so about the seasonality, you said in January, February, you don't see a lot of demand. So do you just have a lot of your places empty, or do you maybe try and find locals who want to rent it for like a month or two?
Yeah, obviously, if I could get somebody wanting to come rent for a month or two, that would be great. It's easy to say that because everybody else in Chicago is thinking the same thing.
Mm.
And you're talking about your rates being so low, and everyone has the opportunity to book, 7,000 places in Chicago. Um, it's easy to say that, hey, I'll just get somebody for 1 month, 2 months. It doesn't always happen that way. You end up getting occupancies of like 40% at low ADRs, so you still take losses no matter what. There's nothing you could do about it.
Got it. Yeah, there's no magic pill there.
Right.
um, cool, man. So one question for you is, you mentioned that you set up most of the deals with those landlords on um, like a handshake arrangement. If you were to start over again, like, would you do that different?
So obviously, you get excited about somebody giving you the opportunity to get into a whole bunch of units. I wouldn't have gotten that opportunity from nobody else. So obviously, it's easy to say to, like, if you could go back in time, what can you change? And even if I could go back in time, I'd be able to put stuff in that contract to be able to get out of it faster than I was able to get out of it. I had like 90-day out clauses in that contract after I made it, after negotiating with that. But now I wish I had, like, at the end of the month, out clauses, because I never would have expected what would happen now during, COVID. But yeah, definitely, it's always best to put things on paper. Um, it was almost that like we were adding units so fast, and we had the original units under like a standard lease that landlord tenant has in Chicago. But we needed to make it more of like a commercial lease business agreement between us two, because there was like too much into it and going on. And yeah, I do feel like our relationship got sour after having to go through that negotiation as well. We stopped talking to each other and only talk through lawyers. So the thing is, when it gets to that point, like, you only want to do business with people that you can, call and talk to. I don't like being in business. Like, I know some of my colleagues are, doing business with big property management companies that, like, you just live and die by the contract. For me, the contract really doesn't mean much. It's about the relationship you have with the person across from you, because things are going to change. And I never followed a contract to its entirety, ever, ever, ever. So to me, it's contract is just words on a paper that sometimes, come of value. But whatever the case is, our relationship didn't work out with the initial landlord, and I was, because of the COVID time, I started decommissioning all the units with him, because it's if your landlord is not working with you to, get through this, if it becomes like an adversary versus a partner, you don't want to do business with them. So he was my first person, like, hey, I need to get out of all my units with him. What can I negotiate with him to get out of? So yeah, to let you know, at a point in February 2019 or 2020, I had 165 units. but I don't have 165 units at this day. You know, I reduced significant amount of units since COVID started. At this time right now, I have about 100, which is still a decent amount, but you know, to boost your business like 30 something percent, is not fun.
No, no, I understand that. What about the onboarding of those properties? Because I imagine if you just take on so many new properties in such a short time, like how do you manage that in terms of finances? Because I imagine you have to pay maybe a couple months of rent upfront, a deposit, and
Right.
then did you have to furnish those units as well?
So I had to furnish them myself, so I had to come up with the money for that. But the way I was able to scale up so fast and like so easily in the initial is with my landlords. I negotiate upfront rent credits, like the first 2 to 3 months for free, and then there's no security deposit or movement fee or anything like that. So I'm able to make back my furniture costs initially after 3 months, depending on like the time of like the year I onboarded these units. So it was easy for me to recycle that cash over and over again to be continuously adding money. So initially, I would just take proceeds from the business, put it back in to buy new furniture, and I make that money back within like 2 3 months. So all of my deals that I do, I won't do a deal if I don't get rent off upfront for free. That's just my
Mm.
criteria, and that's kind of sometimes puts me back into getting some units because some landlords are like, no, your competitors are offering no free rent up front, and I'm like, yeah, for also my competitors, I haven't raised like $10 million, whatever, $100 million, Sonder raised and stuff. So um, I tell them, the difference between them and me is you get the person in front of you, a local person in Chicago, that if stuff does go wrong, we'll figure it out together. And sometimes that works. They understand that you're in front of you. Like I know during the situation, like a lot of the big time players left these landlords empty handed, and I didn't.
Got it. What about is because you furnish the units yourself? So
Yeah,
the units that you reduced, you said you went down from 165 to about 100. Does
yeah.
that mean you now have in storage like 65 furnished
Almost,
sets?
yeah, almost. So but to take it back a little bit to answer your question, like how I furnished them, I told you from a capital perspective, I was recycling money up front with those upfront rent credits. But um, I would I would work with my sister. This is what she was good at. She's good at designing and stuff like that. But before it was fun for her. All of a sudden, when she started working with me, she doesn't like designing anymore because we churn out so many units and it doesn't become fun when you have to do like 10 20 units at a time. So luckily she is good at doing what she's good at doing. We buy stuff from like Wayfair, Amazon, IKEA, Target, Walmart, nothing special. But I would say my units are um, top 5% in best looking units in Chicago on Airbnb. And then within that is we intake all the items. Intaking items is probably like the biggest headache to make sure all those boxes come in and storing them. And then you hire a lot of handymen. We use an app called like TaskRabbit to like get like as many handymen as possible. I would be running like 6, 7, 8 of them, and you make that initial relationship with them and start using them going forward without taking it off that app or whatever. So that's kind of like how we did it, and eventually, things come about. You pay people well, and you you find good people, then you could get stuff up and running. So don't get me wrong, it's really challenging. I'm not super involved in the onboarding of the units, but I know my sister goes through like the craziest stuff with like um, getting these units up and running, and luckily I'm not involved in that. And then when to answer your question about like the decommissioning of the units, so um, when I decommissioned 60, maybe 20 of them were not my furniture, so that helps. Maybe 15 of them, I gave the furniture away to the landlord to get out of the deal and paid him money on top of it. Like that was my way out with my initial landlord. that I don't have a relationship with anymore. And then other ones, I took the furniture out and put it in storages all over basements and buildings I own or like garages. We have like 15 units worth of furniture right now. A lot of this, a lot of this stuff. Um, I also agree with people's methodology where it's like once it's money, furniture costs a lot of money when you put it in, but after you put it in, it's not worth anything. The cost of having to like take away all these mattresses that are nasty used, and then like this furniture that's broken, you're disassembling furniture to put in storage to reassemble again, and you're paying for storage. Like the cost is not worth it. Sometimes you just discard what you have, but the cheapness in me, it made me like save all that stuff, and I hope I get value out of it, or I might end up just discarding it at some point.
Yeah, yeah, it's so true. I mean, they say like when you buy a car, as soon as you drive it out of the showroom, it drops in value by like 30%. With furniture, that's pretty much like 70%. It's
Yeah,
crazy. When I was a student, I furnished my entire room because I had no money. I furnished it entirely with furniture that other people literally just put on the street.
right,
But it still functions.
right.
The couch, you can still sit on it. Um,
There you go.
so yeah, that's funny. Yeah, furniture. Um, cool, man. So we talked about a lot of things. I really understand and appreciate your model of dealing with a few larger owners versus having, you know, like let's say you have 165 owners under a management model. That means you have to maintain relationships with 165 people, which obviously is complicated. It's not something that you necessarily want to do. So I think that model is really awesome. What's your vision for the next year or two?
So for me, my vision is I'm month to month trying to survive what we're going through right now. Um, like once COVID hit, like in March, I lost all my bookings overnight. Airbnb's extenuating circumstance or whatever policy that they changed. I lost everything. And at the same time, my landlords, I owed them, $300,000 worth of rent at the end of the month. So like the day that like this happened, where it hit the U.S., and then everyone was like, "Hey, lockdown, lockdown, we need to stop everything." Is I started just showing up to like my landlord's offices and telling them, "Hey, there's a situation." Like they got really upset. They're like, "I've never had somebody just show up without telling me they're showing up to talk about business." But I'm like, "This is the situation." Um, and I told them, "Hey, I need to exit out. I need out. There's no way I'm going to be able to pay rent. There's no reason why you need to have me in your buildings, and we need to, part ways." So I had about 9 landlords with those 165 units, and my strategy was stick with the two or three landlords that I've had a good relationship with, that I have the most units with. So with these two landlords, I have maybe like 90 of my units, and they were the most understanding about the situation, and they were like, "Okay, we'll come up with a solution to let's share revenue, or let's make it half rent for you for until you're able to get back on your feet." Which was like the most amazing like conversation to like hear, especially with my two biggest landlords. But the remainder seven, with some had like 10 units, some had 20, some had two, some had one. I start that relationship with the landlord, hoping that keep on adding more, but sometimes it doesn't happen. So some landlords are very understanding about the situation and say, "All right, hey, just take up your stuff and leave." I'm like, "Okay, great." Other landlords were like, "Hey, I'm gonna shoot you if you don't pay me my money." Um, I had that happen, or "I'm gonna sue you until you have nothing left," and saying stuff like, I'm not a COVID charity organization. You're paying me my money, or we evict you, and blah blah blah." And this was like initially like right when this happened, right? So I'm like, "Okay, let's see how it goes." Fortunately, after like a lot of persistence and negotiation, I was able to settle out of these contracts. Some contracts I had to pay, some I had to give up furniture, some I had to say that, hey, I'm going bankrupt anyway, so I'm not going to even pay you. But whatever it is, like I settled out of all of them, or all of the ones that I wanted to settle out of. It was like it was the worst thing that could ever happen, but it was like perfect storm of like being able to get out of these deals that I wanted to get. I got out of every deal that I wanted to get out of, without huge financial burden. Some financial burden, but not huge. So at the end of it, I was able to stick with two landlords that I have right now, and with them, they said, like, listen, let's see how things go month by month. During the times of March, April, May. In March, I actually had some pretty good occupancy. I had 80% occupancy, but at super low rates. I had a strategy of like, hey, who's actually going to stay at my units? Nobody's traveling, but only locals could stay out of my units. And what I'm going to do is, if a local can get a vacant unit for $2,000 rent right now, I'm gonna have my furnished unit for 1,900. I'll beat the long-term tenant vacant unit market, and that was decently successful. This is kind of like when most of our colleagues did it too. Um, this is like kind of when Sonder did it, but I did it like immediately, like the next day, and I was able to be pretty successful for March, to get 80% occupancy. Um, in April, it was actually, I was like, hey, things might have gotten a little bit better. Let me increase some prices in April, and let's not just focus on these long-term tenants. So I kind of increased prices, changed my price lab settings around a little bit, and it ended up being a bad gamble. I ended up getting like 65% occupancy, but similar type revenue. Um, so it's not worst thing at the end of the day. It actually might be good that I had the same revenue as March, but at lower occupancy from an operating cost perspective. And then May, it just ended up getting better, back to like the 75, 80% occupancy, with higher ADRs than the previous months. And then June, again, better than May, and it's again at like 80%, 85% occupancy. Um, but still, this is 50, 40% less than what it should be from the previous year. So my guess right now is July is going to even be better than June, and August is even going to be better than July, and then September, like that's when my bell curve of Chicago goes down, and it's just going to go down as like normal. I think things are going to get better, but not like what it was last year. And I don't think this model of master lease is like so sustainable from the revenue I'm getting as of today. I need to convince my landlords that I have right now that, hey, um, this is just a lost cause, for this year. We need to stick to this, percentage of revenue share that we have going on right now until things bounce back, hopefully next year. But they are in a contract that's month to month, so they could just say no, and then my business is done completely. So it's very like do or die for me in the situation right now, because one of the landlords is saying like, hey, my long-term tenant demand is still there. Why do I need to give you a break if I could just rent it out to somebody else and get paid my full amount? And I said, yeah, I understand. And if that's the case, then I need to part ways with you. Hopefully, we could do this again next year. I have to scale right back up with it. And he said, all right, let's talk in the middle of July to see where we're at with things. So like hopefully in like July, things get better and I'm able to pay him rent to tell him to like let's take it easy 1 more month, 2 more months, and then hopefully get him into like the winter time, and then him see that like, hey, he's not going to rent it out to a long term tenant, so just keep me until like however much I could pay him. But I have been paying them, decent amount of money for being in a pandemic. To be able to make the revenues I'm making is no joke. There's a lot of people that are making $0. And I was making $200,000 in March, $200,000 in April. So they were at break even and slight losses during those months. But finally, during this last month of May, I made a little profit. With the current terms I had. and then June it's going to be the same thing. So I'm not at a complete loss. I'm paying down my debt a little bit. You know, some of these government funding loans are helping to be able to get me through this. So at the end of it, I'll be okay in the sense of like I don't have anything bad on my record or anything, and I won't get sued by anybody. But um, I was able to from my business for the money that I made in 2019. I made about like $3.2 million in 19, and I was running at a 20% net income margin. So like like $600,000-700,000 worth of net income. I was able to buy some buildings. So I won't come out of this like in the worst position. But there's a lot of upside if I'm still sticking around till next year. Um, if I was able to get through this, then being able to add more units, I'm very confident that I could do that operationally. And if the demand is back, I want to get my business to like 2x, 3x, 4x, 5x. Whatever I can to do this, what I want to do. So it's really do or die for me for the next few months. So let's see how it goes.
Okay, yeah, let's hope for the best. And the one expression that I keep thinking of is how they say like smooth waters don't make outstanding captains. That's what I mean, like for because obviously for us it's been difficult as well. And that's kind of how I feel. This whole crisis is almost like it's like an entrepreneurial storm almost, that it does. I feel like it does sharpen our skills, and it just makes us grow personally. So if we can get through this, then we can pretty much get through anything, because I mean it will never get worse than this, right?
No, I can't.
What we've gone through for the last 3 months.
Right.
So before we wrap this up, one question I want to ask you is, I mean, for you to have that many units and to suddenly have all your bookings canceled, having to negotiate with all these landlords, I can only imagine how much stress that must have caused. How did you mentally deal with that?
Uh, I don't know how I did it, to be honest. I got that question from one of my colleagues that went through like the 2008 crisis and he's in real estate development, and he went from like having a lot to having to move in with his parents, with his family, wife and kids. And he asked me, he's like, I don't get how you're talking to me, not being like super stressed. And then I just think it was like so overwhelming of like all the stuff that was happening. And really, maybe in the back of my mind, I said like it was nothing wrong that I did. This is something that once in a lifetime, in the next 1,000 years, like it's a once in a lifetime thing. And what I did was just be super transparent to all my business partners and my team, about the situation, and just play day by day, and the little wins that I got after the biggest loss of my life was, kept me going to get motivation to the next one. And then finally I kept knocking off like termination of like agreements with my landlords, and it just keep me motivated to keep negotiating and keep getting there. So, maybe initially it was just too overwhelming and I didn't understand like the extent of what was going on. But I was ready to just like, all right, we got to figure out, there's nothing else I could do.
Awesome, man. Well, congratulations on your success and making it through this crisis the way that you did. You're also part of our STR Legends mastermind, so I'm excited to connect with you more and be on this journey together and grow together. So thank you for taking the time to speak to me on this podcast. It's definitely really interesting to hear how you manage all of this, especially during the crisis. I think we can learn a lot from that. So yeah, any final words before we wrap this up?
So my thing is having a reputation, having the right business partners that you're working with will set you up for success. Choose your partners wisely.
Choose your partners wisely. I like that one. All right, Sayed, thank you so much for joining us. And to the listeners, thank you for listening. Or if you're watching on YouTube, thank you for watching. And we'll see you next week with another podcast of Get Paid for Your Pets. Take care.
Take care.